What would you do if a man you buried a day ago started groaning beneath the soil? I was fired for his death, publicly disgraced, privately shattered. But standing by that fresh grave, shovel in hand and disbelief in my chest, I realized he wasn't dead at all, and that was just the beginning. I used to believe that medicine was the closest thing to a sacred calling. You diagnose, you treat, you hope. Sometimes you even save. But when Paul Winter died on my watch, all that belief shattered. He wasn't just another patient, he was a high-profile donor, a local businessman, and the face of a children's hospital campaign. His death wasn't just tragic, it was televised. Cameras were already circling the hospital for his last days, and I, Dr. Rebecca Lane, 34, hematologist, was the one who signed off on his final chart. The autopsy was bypassed at the family's request. They said he had suffered enough. The board needed a scapegoat, and I was conveniently expendable. One press release later, I became the doctor who misdiagnosed the dying man. But something about Paul's case had always sat wrong with me. His symptoms were erratic, his test results inconsistent. One day he'd be breathless and weak, the next day he was walking the halls, cracking jokes. I told the board I suspected malingering, maybe Munchausen's, but they dismissed me as paranoid. I had a history of over-investigating. Whatever that means. I might have let it go if it weren't for what happened at his funeral. It was an overcast Tuesday. The grave was already dug, and most of the guests had left, leaving only me and the cemetery caretaker, Mark Turner, who was tamping down the last of the soil. He was a man in his 60s, lean and quiet, with the type of voice that sounded like gravel soaked in whiskey. I lingered, not because I respected Paul, I didn't, but because I needed to see the end of it. Closure, or maybe justice. Then we heard it. A low, muffled groan. At first I thought it was wind, but Mark froze. His eyes locked on the grave. Another groan. Louder. I've buried 200 people, he said, pale as chalk. And none of them ever talked back. We didn't speak, we just moved. Mark grabbed the shovel, I grabbed another. 10 minutes of wild, panicked digging later, we cracked open the lid of Paul Winter's coffin. Only it wasn't Paul Winter inside. It was a man about his age, sure, but leaner, rougher, clearly someone who hadn't been sleeping on 1,000 thread-count sheets. He gasped for air like a man reborn. Mark dropped to his knees, muttering a prayer. I don't know who you think I am, the man rasped, but I'm not him. I was drugged. I woke up in a suit in a box. He had no ID, no wallet, and no idea how he ended up in Paul Winter's coffin. All he remembered was working on a construction site weeks ago and then, nothing. I brought him home. Call it guilt or instinct, but I couldn't let him go back into the system, not when someone clearly wanted him gone. Over the next week, Mark helped get him food and clothes while I ran quiet lab tests. The man had minor traces of sedatives and bruising that didn't line up with a natural illness. His fingerprints? No match in any public database. And then it hit us, Paul Winter had faked his death. By the time I saw Paul Winter's face on a yacht in Greece, sipping champagne next to a woman in Versace, I realized the rabbit hole went deeper than I'd feared. I didn't sleep the night we unearthed him, the man who had nearly been buried alive. We called him Sam for now. No ID. No memory. Just terror in his eyes when he woke up in that coffin and a haunting question on repeat, why me? Mark and I kept Sam hidden in a guest room at the caretaker's cottage. He was too shaken to be alone, and I didn't want to risk someone recognizing him. The first few days were like babysitting a ghost. He barely ate, jumped at every sound, and stared at his hands like they didn't belong to him. Then I remembered something. Paul Winter had been deeply in debt before his illness turned him into a local saint. I had seen financial documents during my time treating him, papers his assistant left behind in the lounge. He owed millions. quiet gambling debts. Failed business ventures. Money that didn't add up. I needed help. Not a lawyer. Not a doctor. Someone who knew the underworld from the inside out. That's how I met Jack Calder. Jack was a retired cop who'd lost his leg chasing a suspect through a construction site 5 years ago. He drove a battered yellow taxi now, worse for wear but fast on corners. I'd treated his wife once, years ago, and he'd never forgotten it. When I called and asked to meet, he showed up 10 minutes early, standing tall on a steel prosthetic and leaning against his cab with arms crossed. "Someone faked their death," he said when I told him the story. "And you found a guy alive in their grave?" "Yeah," I said. "And I think they switched places." He whistled. "I've heard of schemes before, but that's biblical." Within a day, Jack reached out to his old precinct contacts and got confirmation. Paul Winter's death certificate had been fast-tracked by a private physician flown in for a second opinion. His body was never seen by a coroner. The funeral home received a closed casket with a death report attached. No one questioned it. He was rich, influential, and supposedly dying. But the real kicker came 2 days later when Jack burst into my kitchen waving his phone like a madman. "He's not dead," he said, voice sharp. "Look." It was a grainy but clear photo from a European paparazzi site. The man they claimed was a French shipping tycoon bore an uncanny resemblance to Paul Winter, minus the frailty, plus a tan. He was laughing, surrounded by people. Alive. Sam looked over my shoulder and whispered, "That's him." "You're sure?" "Positive. He's the guy who came to the site 2 weeks before I went missing. Said he was buying the property." I froze. "What site?" "The one I was working on. Near the port. Private warehouse job." Mark, silent until then, muttered, "The same port where Paul's company leased a shipping container 6 months ago." Something clicked. Paul Winter hadn't just faked his death. He'd staged it, using Sam, a disposable, undocumented worker, as a body double. Someone no one would miss. Someone the world wouldn't notice going missing. And someone they'd drug, dress in his suit, and bury alive in his place. Jack found the link first: 3 names, 2 shell companies, and a warehouse lease tied to a logistics firm that didn't exist before last year. But what we didn't know yet was that Paul hadn't just faked his death, he'd abandoned a child in the process. Jack worked fast. His old detective instincts kicked in like muscle memory. Within 48 hours of confirming Paul Winter was very much alive and drinking rose in Europe, Jack traced financial trails so tangled they could only mean one thing: money laundering. A company called Terranova Maritime Logistics had made significant deposits into Winter's account 6 months before his supposed diagnosis. Another company, Elmira Holdings, registered in Belize, had arranged for the private physician who signed off on Paul's death. Both companies were ghost shells, run by proxies. Jack's theory? Paul owed money to someone dangerous, and this was his escape clause. Whoever helped him run, Jack said grimly, was paid well. And they don't leave loose ends. Sam was one of those loose ends. Meanwhile, I tried to keep Sam grounded. He was slowly regaining fragments of memory. One night, over reheated soup, he remembered a white van, a chemical smell, and someone in a European accent saying, "Make it look real." He also remembered a little boy. "He kept clinging to my leg," Sam whispered. "Called me uncle even though I'd only met him once. Said his mom didn't wake up that morning." That broke something in me. I had seen too many kids orphaned by men like Paul Winter, men who wore wealth like armor and used charm to cover rot. I needed to find that child. Mark was the one who did. He came to my door one rainy morning, soaked and shaking. "There's a boy. About 5. Someone dropped him at St. Agnes Orphanage last week. No name, no record. Just said his mother was sick and his father had left. He's been asking for Sam. We rushed there immediately. The moment Sam entered the playroom, the boy ran to him like gravity had yanked them together. "Uncle," he cried, burying his face in Sam's jacket. Sam froze. Then knelt down slowly. "Danny?" The child nodded. I introduced myself to the staff as a former physician looking to help. The matron looked tired and overwhelmed. "No one's come for him. And honestly, if someone did, I'm not sure I'd let them take him. He hasn't spoken to anyone since he arrived, except now." I made a choice right there. I told them I wanted to begin guardianship proceedings. Mark, without hesitation, offered to foster him in the meantime. "Been alone too long anyway," he said, brushing crumbs off his coat. "House could use some laughter." We filed the paperwork that day. But outside the orphanage, as I watched Mark lead Danny to the car, I turned to Sam. "This isn't just about Paul anymore. He left behind a child. A trail. If he thought he could disappear without consequences, he was wrong." That night, I sat at my kitchen table, writing affidavits and printing out copies of every piece of evidence we'd uncovered. I was going to clear my name. I was going to protect this boy. And I was going to make sure Paul Winters saw the inside of a courtroom. You think you know who you are, until a DNA test tells a different story. Jack was just helping out. Driving. Investigating. Protecting us. But a strand of hair from a buried suit and a childhood photo would change everything. It turns out, the scam ran deeper than fraud. It was theft, of identity, bloodline, and legacy. Jack never liked the attention. Even after we uncovered Paul Winters' escape, rescued Sam, and found Danny, Jack stayed in the background. He said he was too old to play hero and too broken to matter. But I saw the way he looked at Danny when Mark brought the boy around. Not pity, recognition. Jack didn't remember much about his own family. He'd grown up in foster homes, bounced around until he aged out and joined the Marines. He never knew his father. His mother had vanished when he was 4. No records, no photos, just a tarnished locket he kept in his glove compartment. One day, Mark, of all people, had an idea. "You said that Winter Kid's real father might have been someone important, right?" he asked me while fixing a loose hinge on my porch. "Why not test the boy? Just to be sure." It made sense. Paul had forged his way into money, and if he wasn't who he claimed to be, maybe he'd stolen more than just a new name. I took a cheek swab from Danny, filed the paperwork, and requested a match against international genetic databases under sealed credentials. It was routine. Clinical. I didn't expect what came back. A 98% familial match. But not to Paul Winter. To Jack Calder. The email arrived while Jack was fixing my fence. I opened it. Read it twice. Then once more. When I told him, he didn't speak for a full minute. "That's impossible," he finally said. "I never had kids." "You did," I said gently. "Or at least, someone took your son and never told you." Jack sat down hard on the porch step. His eyes were damp. "My mother disappeared when I was 4. Maybe she didn't disappear. Maybe someone took her too." I dug deeper. 2 days later, I found it. A hospital record from 1991, a woman named Clarissa Calder admitted under false pretenses, discharged with a newborn she was told had complications and needed state care. No follow-up. No transfer documents. She died in a hit-and-run 2 months later. No one claimed her body. Paul Winters' birth certificate was issued under the same hospital registrar. Falsified name. Switched identity. The real Paul, Jack's son, was never adopted. He was raised under another man's name. Used. Erased. Until Paul, whoever he really was, stole that identity for his own scam. Jack had a son. He had a grandson. And someone had stolen both from him. I always thought I'd die alone, Jack said that night, holding the DNA report like it might vanish. Turns out, I've been a father longer than I ever knew. Meanwhile, I filed a formal appeal with the Medical Ethics Board using the evidence we'd gathered: Sam's toxicology report, the forged death certificate, video footage of Paul Winter alive and well, and a sworn affidavit from the cemetery worker who heard the groaning. The hearing was set for next month. But my phone wouldn't stop ringing. News had already leaked about the man who returned from the dead. About the doctor who had been fired for trying to tell the truth. And about the child left behind by a fake death. They stripped my title, blamed me for a death that never happened, and left me with nothing but questions. But standing in front of the ethics board, flanked by a living, breathing corpse and the child he nearly left behind, I knew this was my moment. My vindication. My beginning. The hearing room was sterile, wood-paneled, and filled with quiet tension. The Medical Ethics Board sat behind a long curved desk, and I sat opposite them, feeling 1,000 pounds heavier than my actual weight. Jack was beside me, not just as a friend, but as someone who had risked everything to help me uncover the truth. He wore a clean jacket over his old prosthetic, but his eyes were steady, calm. Sam sat to my left, freshly shaven and nervously tapping his knee under the table. He still had nightmares, but today he looked alive, more than Paul Winter ever did in his hospital bed. My statement was concise. I detailed the inconsistencies in Paul's symptoms, my requests for further examination that were denied, and the rushed certification of his death. Then I presented the photo of Paul alive in Greece, the toxicology report from Sam's blood, and the DNA results confirming that the boy Paul abandoned was Jack's biological grandson. The board was silent for a long time. Then the chairwoman asked a question I didn't expect. "Dr. Lane, if your license is reinstated, what's next for you?" I blinked. Then smiled. "I build a home," I said simply. "I raise a child who was nearly lost to a lie. And I go back to doing what I was meant to do, treat people with truth and compassion." The board deliberated in private for 20 minutes. When they returned, they didn't just clear my name, they issued a public apology on behalf of the hospital, admitting the investigation had been biased and influenced by Paul Winter's media presence. My license was reinstated with full honors. But it wasn't just a career that had been restored that day, it was my sense of purpose. My voice. My fight. That evening, we all gathered at Mark's little cottage. Danny clung to Jack's leg like a barnacle, and for the first time since meeting him, Jack cried openly. "He's got my eyes," he kept whispering. "God, he's got my eyes." I brought cake, cheap, sweet, and perfect. Mark poured whiskey. Sam made jokes about becoming a motivational speaker. We laughed like survivors. Because we were. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Jack and I stood on the porch watching Danny and Sam kick a soccer ball in the yard. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "I do. More now than ever." "I was thinking," Jack said, clearing his throat awkwardly, "if you ever." "I don't know," felt like building something permanent. Together. "I've got a garage we could turn into a nursery." I turned to him, stunned. "Jack." "No pressure," he said, quickly backtracking. "I mean, not right away. But if you're thinking about marriage or family, maybe I'm not too late for it." I took his hand. Strong, rough, familiar. "You're right on time." We buried a lie. Dug up the truth. Built a home out of broken things. But just when life began to feel safe again, the ghost we exposed came back, not in silence, but in handcuffs and headlines. And with him, came a final secret that none of us were ready for. Paul Winter, or whatever his real name was apprehended in Italy while boarding a private jet under a falsified diplomatic passport. Turns out, Interpol had been tracking a network of fraud rings that matched his pattern for months. Our evidence had cracked open a long-dormant case, and when they ran facial recognition on the yacht photo Jack found, they moved fast. 2 weeks later, he was extradited to the U.S. under tight security. Jack and I watched the news in silence as footage played of Paul stepping off the plane, wrists cuffed, face hidden beneath sunglasses and arrogance. Sam watched too, jaw clenched. Danny was asleep upstairs, unaware that the man who left him for dead was back on American soil. A week later, I was summoned to testify. The courtroom was packed. Paul sat beside his attorney, stone-faced, as the charges were read: faking his death, kidnapping, medical fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and child abandonment. The list felt endless. When I took the stand, he didn't even look at me. Sam gave his testimony next. Voice shaking but resolute. He took my life, my job, my name. Buried me alive to save himself. Then the judge asked Paul if he had anything to say. That's when he finally spoke. "I'm not who you think I am," he said calmly. "I never was." The courtroom hushed. "What I did was wrong," he continued. "But I didn't steal from Jack Calder. I was Jack Calder. Or so I was told." He glanced across the room. Straight at Jack. "Your mother," he said, "wasn't hit by a car. She sold me." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Jack's hands gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. "She was desperate," Paul said. "A man, someone with influence, paid her to disappear and gave me his name. Winter. He raised me like a son, but I wasn't one. Not really. Just a placeholder." The room fell into stunned silence. Later, back at the house, I sat with Jack at the kitchen table while Danny played quietly with Mark in the living room. "He's not your son?" I asked carefully. "No," Jack said, voice distant. "But Danny is my grandson. That part's real. I did the second test myself." So who was the real Paul Winter? We found out 3 days later. Authorities ran DNA from Paul's fake birth certificate against a sealed inheritance case from 30 years ago, a dispute involving the estate of a wealthy shipping tycoon who died mysteriously overseas. The heir had gone missing, presumed dead. But the family never gave up hope. Turns out, that heir was Jack. His biological father. Jack Calder had been robbed of his family name, his inheritance, and his place in the world. And the man who stole it wasn't his son, but another abandoned child, raised in lies, who had become the villain of all our stories. I once thought this story was about betrayal, about a man who faked his death and a doctor who lost everything trying to prove it. But now I see it clearly. It was always about healing. About finding family in the rubble. About building something real from the ashes of a lie. It took 6 more months for everything to settle. Paul, real name unknown, took a plea deal in exchange for revealing the network that helped him flee. He'll serve decades, but none of us cared about his sentence. Justice, in our eyes, had already been served the moment he was unmasked. What mattered more was what came after. Jack was officially confirmed as the biological heir to the Winter estate. DNA results, decades-old paperwork, and testimony from a surviving member of the family sealed it. He inherited everything Paul once claimed: property, offshore accounts, even a crumbling seaside villa in Spain. "Funny," he told me one night, standing on the balcony of our new apartment. "He had everything and still chose to run. Me? I never wanted a thing, and now I've got it all." He didn't mean the money. He meant us. Danny was thriving. Mark finalized the adoption just before Christmas, but Danny already called him Grandpa. His nightmares stopped. He began sleeping through the night, drawing pictures of a house with 5 stick figures, me, Jack, Sam, Mark, and himself, under a rainbow that always had too many colors. We hung every one on the fridge. Sam, once the man who woke up buried, now worked as a facilities manager at the hospital. They gave me my job back, and I used my reinstated status to make damn sure he got hired with full benefits. He started dating a woman named Carla from radiology. She had kind eyes and never asked about his past. As for Jack, he surprised us all. He didn't touch most of the inheritance. Kept his taxi. Used the money instead to fund a prosthetics foundation for injured officers. His first grant paid for a bionic upgrade, one that let him run again. I never thought I'd walk down the aisle, he told me with a nervous laugh as we planned our wedding. Let alone walk at all. We were married in spring. Nothing big, just a garden ceremony with close friends, a borrowed string quartet, and Danny as our ring bearer, grinning like the world finally made sense. I wore a simple white dress. Jack wore a navy suit with his father's watch, gifted back to him by the estate lawyer who'd held onto it for years. There was no drama. No press. Just peace. And joy. And a baby on the way. The night we found out, Jack placed his hand gently on my stomach, eyes glassy. I thought I'd be alone forever, he whispered. You never were, I said. You were just waiting for the right people to find you. Some legacies are inherited. Others are built, painfully, brick by brick, from the ruins of deceit. Ours was both. And in the quiet of our new life, I knew, this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a family.